All right, here we go. This is the QTR podcast. How the hell is everybody today? This podcast, like all of my podcasts, is brought to you by my patrons. Patrons are people that sign up and donate a monthly recurring sum to help support me and the podcast on Patreon. I appreciate the shit out of you guys. I'm going to shout out some of the people that have been supporting me for a while, and then we're going to get on with the show relatively quickly this morning because who wants to waste time with nonsense and banter? I was just listening to a couple of great podcasts this week, had mid-roll ads. I hate them. That's why I will never stop interviewing somebody in the middle of a podcast. I'll always just put my shit here up front, fast forward if you want, or be nice and listen, whatever. I don't care. The important thing is that we're here together, holding hands and singing Kumbaya while the world burns in the background. Having said that, this podcast brought to you by my friends over at JM Bullion. JM Bullion is my exclusive gold and silver provider, the only place I buy my gold and silver bullion. They ship discreetly. They have been in business for nearly a decade now. They've done over $3 billion in sales. They have a website that has incredible inventory on it. Their prices are reasonable. They're hell of a nice people to work with. And QTR podcast listeners, can reach out to Laura, Laura, at jmbullion.com. And Laura would be happy to help you out, give you personalized service. If you have questions about shipping, inventory, pricing, whatever, Laura will make sure that you get taken care of. So shoot her an email and tell her that QTR sent you so that JM Bullion continues to support the podcast and continues to maintain our long-standing relationship that we've had that is fruitful. I feel it's been fruitful as a customer, but also as somebody that can honestly advocate for them as a great place to buy gold and silver bullion. Having said that, that's enough kissing their ass. I'm sure they'll understand I have other things to do today. This podcast also brought to you by my friends over at Sanglucci Trading. I love Sanglucci. At Sanglucci on Twitter is in my podcast description. You can click on that to follow him. They have an incredible community called the Steam Room. You can apply to join the Steam Room using the link in my podcast description. It is a community that tracks flow in the markets, market psychology, oftentimes by checking out moves in the options market. These guys were doing unusual options activity before anybody had ever heard of it or was ever doing it. So they are the original gangsters of it, and as such, I think they have one of the best platforms and the best insights into it out of anybody out there. Also, I know that Lucci and Wall Street Jesus, great people to work with, honest people to do business with, which is why I don't mind shouting them out. A friend of mine, somebody that will help you try out the platform if you want for free. He will just reach out to Sanglucci, tell him QTR sent you, tell him you want to check out the Steam Room. He would be happy to show you around, I'm sure, with no bullshit, no credit card, no nothing. Here, just take a trial. The Q-Man said so. Or sign up and pay for the service, which is also a great idea, and keeps their bank account stocked so that they can continue to support my podcast. It's one big circle jerk of options trading and podcasting love. Having said that, this podcast also brought to you by my friends over at Doomberg. Doomberg is one of my favorite Substacks to read. Doomberg, I would say that they're energy and commodity experts. They really understand what they're talking about. They look at the market through a skeptical lens. Check out my friends at Doomberg. That link is in my podcast description. Also, my long-standing supporters like shipping analyst Jay Mintzmeyer, my buddy Russ Valenti, my friends over at Investors Underground. Thank you so much for your continued support. And finally, support from myself over at a little blog called Fringe Finance. If you like the podcast, check out my blog. It's called Fringe Finance. I post there almost daily. quoththeraven.substack.com. The link is in my podcast description. Thank you to everybody that has been supporting me over there as well. It has been a fruitful endeavor. I get catharsis every day and don't have to pay to get the diarrhea off my brain like I normally would have to with a therapist, and you guys get an email in your inbox every morning at 5 a.m. that you can ignore. So I think that's a pretty good trade. So check out the worst blog in the world, QTR's Fringe Finance, or whatever it's called. No one cares. This podcast has a 3-drink minimum. I am not a financial advisor, an investment advisor, or registered anything. I hold no licenses or registrations. This is not any type of solicitation to buy or sell securities. I would highly encourage you not to do anything that I say. I will remind you that I am an idiot. I get things wrong often, and I am by no means an expert in finance. I'm just a peon in a sea full of imbeciles trying to make his way and drink some brandy in the process. Not bad. Wrapped it all up in under 5 minutes, folks. Not a bad one to listen to this morning if you're going to finally tune in for the introduction garbage. Hello. It's not garbage. I love my sponsors. I really do. And you know what? None of them give me shit about anything. So if you want to support the podcast, instead of being a Patreon, just go say what's up to Lucci, say what's up to JM Bullion, say what's up to my guest today, George Gammon, and his platform, Rebel Capitalist Pro. They've been supporting the podcast as well. And just show them some love on behalf of QTR, and they'll know that it's worth their while to support me, which I appreciate very, very much. It's been cool having the same sponsors for years now, and not having to trade a lot of in or out of them. Although the guy that used to shoot pigs out of the helicopter, remember Helibacon? That guy was fun. I enjoyed shouting that out at the beginning of every podcast. Only my fucking old listeners know that shit. All right. I have with me on the line today my dear friend George Gammon. I have no idea how he continues to make time for me. He's so busy, and he's such a raging success in the podcasting and blogging world. He's got, he's holding conferences. He's milling around with, people in the financial industry. He's wearing nice suits. What's going on, dude? How are you?
Wearing nice suits. Well, yeah, that adds to the credibility right there. No, I'm doing well. I've been battling an eye infection the last month, which is why I haven't been producing a lot of content. But we're getting back to 100% and looking forward to getting back in the mix here real soon.
I'll tell you a quick story. I just dealt with the same exact thing. I don't know the extent of yours, but I was out 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and I was eating a hoagie, and I went to scratch my eye, and I got mayonnaise. I had mayonnaise on my finger, in my eye, and I had I got 4 styes all in the course of 3 weeks after, and dude, it was horrible. Luckily, the Will's Eye Center here in Philadelphia is one of the best ones in the world, but yeah, dude, it was just hell on earth. My eye was swollen shut for 2 months. People are like, "Oh, jujitsu, huh?" I'm like, fucking put mayonnaise in my own eye. How about that one?
Yeah, that's similar to what I had. They're just I'm in Miami seeing a specialist daily because they're concerned that the infection will move from the eyelid itself into the eye, in which case it could potentially cause permanent vision loss. So
is it like cellulitis?
It's kind of, yeah, very close to that. Very close to that.
Interesting. And do you know how it happened? Are you boxing?
No clue. No. I had another surgery on the eye about 6 weeks ago. Then it kind of turned into this. So I was probably more susceptible to something like that. But as far as specifically, I don't have the mayonnaise story. So.
Well, how did you when you first noticed it? Was it just swollen one day? Your eyelid was swollen.
Yeah, it looked like a sty initially on the inside of my left eyelid, but then it just kept growing and growing and growing and growing to my eye was basically swollen shut, and I was in Medellin. I saw a specialist down there because I started to lose my vision, and that's when something could be going wrong there that could cause that permanent vision loss. So I saw a specialist down there. Gave me just elephant antibiotics, went on those, and then I came up to a specialist here in Miami that I knew, and he put me on even stronger antibiotics, and then they cut holes, not to get too graphic, but they had to cut holes in the outside of the eyelid to try to drain it, but they weren't able to do it very well. So, but now it's again, I don't want to TMI here, but last night it's starting to drain quite a lot, and which is great.
Good.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Hopefully, I'll only have about another week of this and get back to normal.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's really weird having something wrong with your eye. And I was having the same issue where I was starting to get I wasn't losing my vision, but I had blurred vision all the time, and it was you really forget how much you take for granted being able to just see.
Yeah, and then you get headaches, and I've had a lot of headaches and nausea because of the blurred vision, and reading and getting on the computer makes it worse. So Anyway, if those people out there are wondering why I haven't done too many whiteboard videos lately or in zero interviews, that's why.
Damn. Well, hopefully you're on the men's, brother. You know, hopefully
Oh,
things
I
are
am. Yeah.
hopefully things are good. But you're not boxing. How come
No,
every
not
time
right
I see a
now.
picture of you, you're always holding your fist up?
Oh, okay. So
I thought you were
that's a
boxing
long
though.
story. No, I used to take boxing lessons when I first retired in 2012 in Las Vegas. When I say boxing lessons, I'm not talking about like at an LA Fitness or something. I'm talking about proper, real, like hardcore boxing lessons.
Right.
But I'm a huge fan of the UFC. And, when I first started doing live events, people wanted their picture taken with me. And it's a little bit like Talladega Nights. Remember Will Smith, where he like doesn't know what to do in the interview, so his hands are just like
Yeah.
randomly moving around. And so I was a little bit like Will Ferrell. Did I say Will Smith? Will Ferrell and Talladega Nights. And so I'm like, I kind of like what the UFC guys do. They always do kind of like the one fist.
Yeah.
So I started doing that. I'm like, this makes sense because I always say that you got to stand up and fight for freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. So it just kind of goes. And so whenever people say, you got to do the fist, I'm like, yeah, you got to stand up and fight for those three things. So
And you have to have a go-to.
that's why I do that.
You have to have a go-to for photos too. You have to have some shit that you do. Like mine has been like the shaka for the last like couple of years. The hang loose sign, whatever. But then people started like attributing. Everybody was like, you do that too much. So I just started giving the peace sign now the last like, you gotta have your little go-to. Funny story about that. Not that you care or that anybody cares. When Renzo Gracie first gave the shaka sign, which is like I think that may be where like the shaka in jiu-jitsu originated from. I think it originated from this photo of Renzo giving the shaka, and I think everybody just kind of assumed that it fit because there's a lot of surf culture in Brazil. There's a lot of crossover between surf culture and jiu-jitsu culture, and I think Renzo said in an interview after that like he was just trying to give a thumbs up, but he had broken his pinky at the last fight, and so just kind of made him look like he was doing that, and then it just stuck. Now everybody does it.
Yeah, it's funny how little stuff like that catches on. And now, whenever or a lot of times when someone wants me to take a picture with them, if I've got my hand down, they'll actually ask me, say, "Can you do the fist? Can you do the fist?" Like, okay.
Fist me, George.
Yeah.
Speaking of being fisted, let's talk about what the American public here is enduring at the hands of our central bank. How's that for a segue, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah.
What are we going to see from the Fed? Well, actually, what are we going to see from the official CPI numbers through the end of the year this year? Let's talk about what the mainstream is kind of suggesting. The idea that inflation has peaked is floating around out there, has been for the last 2 or 3 months. We saw this last 8.3% print kind of was a reality check for a lot of people that thought inflation may have peaked. We got 2 or 3 months here left in the year. What are things going to look like at the end of the year?
Well, about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, something like that, I did some whiteboard videos. And I rarely make predictions, but I did make one prediction, and that was that inflation would go down slightly as measured by the CPI in maybe Q3, Q4 of this year. And I didn't say that it'd go down, 2%. I'd say, maybe we get up to 9 or 8.5 or whatever. And then maybe it comes down to 8 or 7 or 6 or something like that. But then most likely, it probably goes back up because these are the cycles that you see, whether it's the 1940s and an inflationary decade that most people don't talk much about in the United States, or the 1970s. It didn't go up in a straight line, not at all. In fact, I watched a kind of a debate between Milton Friedman and a Keynesian economist that was very well known in the 1970s. This was probably 76, 77. And this was just in a period where they had a little bit of a lull. And the Keynesian economist was claiming victory on inflation. And he was claiming that it was because the government used stimulus to lower the unemployment rate, and that created more goods and services, and that's what brought down the inflation. And Milton Friedman argued, no, they're creating more currency units, and therefore this is going to turn into higher inflation, but there's a bit of a lag. And we know in retrospect that Milton Friedman won that argument. But going back to that prediction, I saw the things that created the inflation in the first place. You can say it was all government intervention, like it always is, due to the COVID, and they're just insane policies and locking down the global economy and destroying supply chains. And then so you decrease supply and you increase demand. Well, that's going to give you consumer price inflation every single time. The question is how they do that. And so I don't know that the supply chains are going to be fixed anytime soon. I think they're still broken, but I think a little bit better. But on the demand side of the equation, they did stop the stimmy checks. Now, there's still a lot of programs out there that are in place that are reducing the average Joe and Jane's expenses. So if you look at their P&L, but there isn't anything right now that's increasing their income like those stimulus checks did, and that's why you saw M2 just absolutely skyrocket. So now, so they do have more purchasing power from the student loans being, forgiven, some of the student loans and some other of these policies, but not to the degree to which we saw in 2020 and 21. So if you conclude that that was why we got up to, let's say, 9 point whatever in CPI, and if you take out one of those factors, then I think it's safe to conclude that the CPI comes down a bit. Again, I'm not saying it goes down to 2%, but it goes down slightly until you get another wave of monetary stimulus, in which case you would expect to see those prices rise again. And I think that that's probably what we'll have. The bond market right now is kind of saying that that's going to happen sometime in 2023, maybe about 9 months, a year. The highest interest rate right now is on the 1-year treasury. So that would lead you to believe that the bond market is saying that the Fed will probably start cutting rates about a year from now. So maybe the August, September or so of 2023. And in which case you would expect inflation to kind of maybe go down slightly, but again, not down to where it was before. And then you get another wave of it. But one thing that people aren't really thinking through is the potential black swan. And, the economy is fundamentally very unsound. And so I think there are a lot of possibilities to get some sort of either financial crisis or maybe better said, an economic crisis.
Yep.
Because I think the next crisis might not be with financial, it might be energy, could be food, it could be a lot of things out there on the horizon. So if you get one of these crises that come about, you could have inflation go from 9% down to negative 2% just within a month or two. Now, this is just unforeseen, very similar to what we saw during the GFC. During the GFC, there was about a 6-month period when we actually had deflation. So that would be harder today because of everything that's happened with the supply chains. But it is possible, if you get another COVID as an example, for inflation to quickly go from 9 all the way down to 2. But that wouldn't be because of the central bank directly. Indirectly, it would, because they're the ones that cause the bubbles and the kind of the black swan, the potential black swan events in the first place, or the central planners and the authoritarians. But that's kind of the way I see inflation most likely playing out, excluding a black swan event. Is it kind of gradually goes down a little bit, maybe down to 7%, 6%, and then something triggers the Fed in 2023, summer of 2023, to start lowering rates. And whatever that is that causes them to start lowering rates is something that has brought inflation down, maybe temporarily, and then the response to that gives us another wave of inflation, and who knows how high it goes then.
Well, let's talk about black swan events. The one that I continue to write about is I still think that the rate hikes we've already consummated over this last 6 months have not caught up to the economy yet. I think, and I can only use 2018 as a comparison, where we hiked, a quarter of a basis point every Fed meeting for 3 years until we finally got to, 2.25 or whatever it was. But we hiked very, very, very slowly and over a very long course of time. And we woke up one day expecting to have a nice holiday morning and hit the eggnog, and all of a sudden everybody's 401k was down 10% one week leading into Christmas. And that, of course, is the famous point when Steve Mnuchin called the banks as if there was anything he could say or do that was going to be of any relevance. But I think, and then, of course, the Fed eventually pivoted after that. I think now, what we've seen is 225 basis points in hikes, soon to be 300 or 400 basis points within a year. And I don't even think we've started to see the economic shock of the rate hikes that have already taken place yet. So I feel like, honestly, I still feel like we are a train heading a million miles an hour into a brick wall. And I think that we are going to notice it one day in the form of we wake up and the credit markets have seized, or there's capitulation in the equity markets. And all of a sudden, there's going to be a snowball rolling down a hill very quickly that's going to be exceptionally difficult to stop. So give me your thoughts on whether or not you agree with me there, and then also expound on some of these other black swan events that you're talking about: energy, food, things that I haven't written about.
Yeah, so as far as there being a lag with monetary policy, I think that's absolutely the case. I don't, we got to remember that the Fed really controls the short end of the curve, but the long end, not so much. So if we go back, let's say 3 or 4 months, the Fed was hiking, but remember that the 10-year was actually going down,
right,
as they would hike, implying that, okay, Fed, if you're going to hike rates, well, then there's just a higher probability that you create a recession, which is going to be disinflationary. And therefore, every time you hike rates, we're going to go down. We're going to take we're going to buy the 10-year. Therefore, yields go down. And so, you have to ask what rates most impact the real economy. And I think that would be the long end of the curve. I mean, obviously, the short end, you're talking about probably corporate debt and, a lot of the bigger institutions in the United States, the publicly traded companies and whatnot. But when you look at the average Joe and Jane, I think they're more dependent on the 10-year. And so if the Fed's raising rates and the 10-year is going up at the same time or at the same level, then yeah, I think that's going to have a lag and it's going to be very impactful. But if you have a scenario where the Fed's raising rates and the 10-year is actually going down, I don't know that would impact the real economy to the same degree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So right now we see the 10-year going up rapidly. We see the entire curve really going up. But I'd like to remind everybody, the yield curve, the 2s and 10s, all the way to the 6 month and the 10-year has been inverted for 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
This is not a good sign. And I remember when the yield curve first inverted about 6 months ago on Twitter, the bulls were coming out saying, "Oh, it's no big deal. It only inverted for 2 or 3 days, and you can't."
I remember that.
You can't read anything into that. Blah blah. Okay, well now it's been inverted for 3 months, and now it's inverted all the way to the 6 month. And now what they're saying is, well, sure, it's inverted with the 6 month and the 10s, but it's not inverted on the 3 month, and that's what you really, really got to watch out for. It's like, yeah, but what happens before it inverts on the 3 month? It inverts in the 6 month. What happens before it inverts in the 1 year? And so it never inverts on the 3 month first. And another kind of secret that I learned from my good buddy Jeff Snyder is, as far as timing goes, because when the 2s and 10s invert, there's an extremely high probability that you get a recession, but it can happen 18 months, 2 years down the road. It's tough to really time. But one thing that you can use that Jeff uses is something that's very bizarre. It's something, I can't remember the exact name. It's called like the 2-year hence, HENCE. So if your listeners just Google Fred, for the St. Louis Fed, 2-year hence, it's a chart of what the expected rate for the 2-year is going to be, like, I don't know, 6 months out into the future, or a specific time frame into the future. It might be 2 years. And according to Snyder, and he knows a lot better than I do, pretty much every time that inverts with the 2-year Treasury itself, that doesn't mean that you're going to get a recession. That means that you're in a recession. Okay. And that the Fed is going to reverse course very, very soon, like within weeks, if not months, if not a week or so, or within the weeks, excuse me. So that's what I would suggest, kind of a little bit of insider information for your listeners to kind of check out. And that's one thing that I've been watching. But just for kind of the people that don't want to dig that deep and get that esoteric, just watch the 3-month and the 10-year. And once that, we got to about 10 basis points, but now it's about 20 basis points. But when that inverts, that's when you know that there's a high probability of things moving a lot quicker as far as the Fed pausing or actually reversing. And that's usually the indicator that you're actually in a recession. Although I think there's a strong argument that we're already in one, considering we've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. As far as a black swan, I don't know if it's too much of a black swan, but as far as something that could really impact markets negatively, is really this issue with China and Taiwan.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what Nancy Pelosi did by going to Taiwan was one of the stupidest things I have ever seen a politician do. Just absolutely nonsensical. I've been listening to Ray Dalio's book.
It's almost like going to Chinatown in the middle of a pandemic that has originated in China. It's almost the worst possible idea you could come up with.
Yeah, but I did hear something that might explain it. I still don't agree with it. But in Dalio, in this book that I'm listening to, it's called The Changing World Order. Very good. He talks about, goes way back in history with all of these Chinese dynasties and, going back thousands of years, and how you see these cycles with countries or nations when they empires, and how they rise and how they fall.
Right.
And one thing that he points out is whenever you get a changing of the guard, where you have one nation coming up and one nation declining, usually what you see is the declining nation will want to start a war sooner than later, and the up and coming nation will want to postpone war for 5 to 10 years. And it's obvious why, because the up and coming nation wants to postpone that hot war if they know it's inevitable.
Right.
They want to postpone it 5 years until they can gain more strength. And the declining nation wants the war to happen as quickly as possible while they still have a comparative advantage. So I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but that's the only thing that makes sense to me.
It reminds me of the headline like last week that I saw, that China now is trying to get their military ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, they said. So while everybody's worried about, they're going to take Taiwan tomorrow, this headline broke last week, I think, or maybe it was even earlier this week. I think it was last week, that China has put out a statement saying they want their military to be capable of taking Taiwan by the year 2027. And I was just thinking, wow, all right, that's 5 years away.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, if you look at it through the lens of the Chinese, I'm not going to say it makes sense, but you can see, historically why they're doing it. And then if you look at it through the lens of the United States, assuming that the politicians are doing this, I mean, who knows? Again, for Nancy Pelosi, see, that's where it doesn't make sense to me. I can't imagine that Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden would do something for the long-term benefit of the United States. They're just doing something, whatever is politically expedient. And I don't understand how poking China in the eye with a stick is politically good for either of them. But maybe there's something there that I just don't see. And there's so many things around the world right now that are just completely baffling. The China policy with COVID, that's another thing that's just a head scratcher to me. Maybe the only thing I can, the only conclusion I can come to, and it's just a random hypothesis, is they're trying to prepare their society for using far fewer resources in the future, knowing that there's a good probability they will go to war with the United States.
Sure, and also I think there's two different. I wrote about this, I don't know, a couple months ago, and I postulated two different things. One was either they knew something about the virus that we don't know, which I don't think is the case at this point. And the second is that along the lines of what you're saying, that maybe they are preparing the country to be able to lock down the supply chain on cue, right? So if you're going to enter into any kind of war with the United States, and I've written over the last couple of weeks, couple of months, that this forthcoming bifurcation of the world between the BRIC nations, headed by China and Russia, and the West, I think is going to be fought in a way that is not, conventional. I don't think it'll be fought through conventional means. I mean, there will be some hot war aspect to it. There will be some military operations that take place, but I think a lot of it is going to be done via the internet, via economic means, and via cutting off the means of production for the things that allow us to have the quality of life that we have. If they can suffocate the dollar and they can substantially lower the quality of life in the United States, at the point where the country's already kind of a powder keg, there's a good chance that they could really sow the seeds of chaos in the country without ever having to launch a military effort, right? And they could go in. Go ahead.
Well, they win without ever shooting a bullet. And I again, looking at Dalio's book and the study of China's history, it would make sense that that's an edge they believe they have. We look at their central planned economy, kind of communist / capitalist society, and we look at the negatives. But some of those things that we see as negatives, they actually see as positives. That they have a benevolent dictator, let's say, that can't be voted out of office, therefore they can make long-term decisions. They would see that as a positive, kind of a central thinking and a plan for the entire country. They see that as a positive, and their ability to just have patience, sit and wait, and also their priority on the collective. So they look at the United States and they say, oh my gosh, it's just collapsing internally. And we're not going to allow ourselves to collapse internally because we have this strong, hierarchical power setup. And so we'll just sit back and, kind of squeeze where we need to with the United States, give them a little more inflation, give them fewer high prices, let them bring manufacturing back, cut them off with the pharmaceuticals or whatever it is. And then we'll just let them do what they do. And, this decentralized weakness of theirs, and just deteriorate right in front of our eyes, like all societies and civilizations have that have gone through these cycles. And the cycle is quite simple. Dalio goes over it, and a lot of historians, I think, make it overly complex, but it's very easy to understand. It's just that old saying that hard times create strong men create good times times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And it just happens over and over and over. It's happened with the Dutch, it's happened with the Portuguese, it's happened with the Chinese, it's happened with the Ottoman Empire, it's happened with Britain, it'll happen with the United States. It's the way we're hardwired as human beings. And so one other black swan, though, that I've been really thinking about, and this may more fall in the category of an actual black swan, meaning that it's not really on anybody's radar, is the dollar going up. So the dollar's at 110 right now on the DXY.
Right.
This creates a massive amount of economic pressure on countries outside the United States. And you say, okay, well, George, who cares? It's not affecting the U.S. Yeah, but eventually it will, right? Eventually, in a global economy, there's a lot of systemic risk. And I don't know what the number is, 120, 130, 140, I don't know. But at some point, the dollar going up is not just going to be XYZ country's problem. It's going to be the United States problem as well. And so I think, and you got to look at why the dollar's going up. Well, it's going up because of all this uncertainty. Okay, well, and also because of interest rate differentials. So you've got the bond market telling you that the Fed's going to raise, let's just say for another 6 months or another year. Okay, so we've got another year of the dollar going up and it's already at 110. I mean, look at what gold's doing. Gold's telling you the exact same thing. And so you have this combined with all of these kind of powder keg type situations from a geopolitical standpoint, which is further tailwind to the dollar. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about the dollar against goods and services in the United States.
Right.
That can continue to depreciate. And, they can continue to, quote unquote, devalue the dollar domestically while the dollar continues to skyrocket against other fiat currencies. People conflate the two, and that's a big, big mistake. Right. So think about this. If you go into a world where the dollar's at 140 and the United States realizes that this is not just crushing other countries, but it will crush the United States as well. What do? I think they go into a Plaza Accord 2.0. Same thing we had in 1985.
What does that
where
look
the
like?
The Fed probably just prints a massive amount of bank reserves to buy the yen, buy the euro, buy whatever to flood the market with dollar bills, the international market, to be clear, the international market with dollars. And so I think the black swan there could be that they miscalculate. Remember when Roosevelt messed with the price of gold? And Rickards always says that he got the price wrong, and it's no surprise that these central planners, they've got all their formulas, and we've seen how well that helps them predict things like inflation transitory, and we've seen how well it helps them, micromanage the economy. Obviously, I'm joking. They do a terrible job of it because the economy, you can't micromanage it. It's not like a thermostat on your wall. So my point there is they try to bring the dollar down, but they inadvertently bring it down too far, and there are all these unintended consequences where the people that were buying dollar-denominated assets like treasuries, all of a sudden they know that the Fed is going to intentionally bring down the dollar. Well, what would you do with your dollar assets if your expenses were denominated in yen? You'd sell them. You'd fire sell them. If you knew let's say the yen at that time is at 150, and you knew that the Fed was going to take it to 70, what the hell would you do with your treasuries?
Right.
You'd fire sell them because the purchasing power of those treasuries in your local currency is going to absolutely plummet.
Yeah, it's gonna get
and this
destroyed.
is one reason why I think that you're getting a bid at the long end of the curve. Because if you're a Japanese pension fund, let's use them as an example again, and you can get, let's say, a 3.5% yield on a 10-year, or for heaven's sakes, a 4% yield on a 1-year, why would you not buy that, especially the 1 year? I mean, and then the argument there is that, well, it's still a negative real yield because the inflation rate is 8.3%. But the Japanese don't care about the inflation rate in the United States. What do they care? Their expenses aren't denominated in dollars. All they care about is the cross rate between the dollar and the yen. So if they can buy the dollar, which they think is going to appreciate in value relative to goods and services in their country, and they can get paid 4%, that's a no-brainer for them, right? Or it could be Japan, it could be Europe, it could be any of these countries with their pensions, sovereign wealth funds, etc. But that happens in reverse if they know, not just making a bet, but they know definitively that the yen is going to appreciate in value, or the euro is going to appreciate in value significantly against the dollar. Then they fire sell everything. Then the long end of the curve skyrockets, and what happens then to the economy in the United States if mortgage rates go from, call it at the time there's 7 or 8%. What happens if they go to 14, 15% within the span of 3 or 4 weeks, because all these foreign entities are dropping the treasuries because they know the Fed is going to devalue the dollar globally. So I think that's a black swan that no one's really thinking about.
Yeah, what do you think about how China and Russia are kind of posturing up here together economically?
Makes sense.
I mean,
makes a lot of sense. China makes stuff and they don't have resources, and Russia doesn't make a lot of stuff and they have resources.
Right, so, exactly. So it's like a match made in heaven, right? Especially if you're going especially if you're going to take on the West. And now I saw Xi and Putin both met with Narendra Modi last week or 2 weeks ago. So they're shoring up their alliance with India as well. And I don't know. Yeah. I wrote an article a couple weeks ago called "A Broken Clock Cries Wolf Twice a Day." And the premise of the article was to take exception with all these people that continually say, anytime an Austrian economist or a skeptic or somebody that has a less than incredibly optimistic, euphoric take on the market offers even a peppering of a dose of reality, people say, oh, well, broken clock's right twice a day, or, oh, you're just crying wolf, right? And I just keep thinking to myself, this just happened with COVID, right? We just went through it with COVID, where me and you and a select group of other people, Chris Martinson, some other people were ahead of the curve saying this is going to be a big fucking deal. Nobody paid attention. We said, look, it's not a big deal until you wake up one morning, and it is. And I feel like, okay, I can understand the argument being made because Austrian economists are essentially playing for all the chips at the end of the day, as Schiff would say, right? They're playing to be right once and for all at the end. And so with every turn of the corner, even though if they get things right seemingly, with the Band-Aid the Fed's able to put on it, and if there isn't exceptional economic collapse, then okay, they're proven wrong. That was their 1 second where they were right, and now they go back to being wrong again. I feel like now there are so many things happening collectively that you really have to have a certain type of ignorance to not at least entertain the idea that there is a small chance that we are on the precipice of things changing meaningfully, relatively permanently, right? We're suffering from an inflationary crisis. We have energy shortages. We're going to have food shortages. There's already food shortages globally. You have Russia and China, who have taken efforts to de-dollarize over the last 10 years, now banding together, supporting each other's economy, supporting each other's currencies. You have Russia going into Ukraine and this precarious situation where the U.S. is part and parcel with a group that's kind of half standing idly by watching it happen and half, supporting Ukraine through these backwards financial assistance packages that we continue to give them, which, by the way, we can't afford, while people in, Detroit are drinking water that looks like mud. And you have China now on the precipice of going into Taiwan at some point, certainly posturing up as if they're going to. Another situation it reminds me of when I used to play the game Risk. When I first started playing that game, I very quickly found out that if you spread yourself too thin, if you want to get a foothold in too many countries with not enough troops, not enough resources, and not enough of a foundation back home, it's a recipe for disaster. And that's what it feels like we're at right now. George, $31 trillion in debt, inflationary crisis, supply chain issues, on this weird limbo between, are we going to defend Taiwan? Are we not going to? Are we going to defend Ukraine? Are we not going to? Very little productive capacity, politically kind of in chaos, right? There's a whole political party pushing for so destructive socialist policies in the country. The country itself, the cities are falling apart. Rates are at 2% going to 4%. I mean, it just feels like, man, could this be the big one? Could this be the big breaking point coming up here?
Yeah, so again, if you're China, just sit back and enjoy the show.
Yeah, it's like in chess when you have a piece
why
pinned.
Fire a bullet?
When you have a piece pinned in chess, right? A lot of times when you first start playing, you immediately want to you want to capture and you want to keep moving. But a lot of times if you have a spot in a good position, it's like, okay, we'll leave that and start playing somewhere else on the board. And then you get into another good spot somewhere, and it's like, okay, now leave that. Now keep playing somewhere else on the board, right? So they're just leaving.
Yeah.
And every day that goes by, it's like they get a little bit more leverage. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No problem. And I don't mean to imply that China doesn't have a lot of problems. I mean, short term, they've got big problems over there as well. But, to your point, I think the only way that you could come to that conclusion, that bullish conclusion, you Austrians are just crying and a broken clock is right twice a day type thing. You'd have to be completely ignorant of economics, and you'd have to be completely ignorant of historic cycles.
Right.
So I could make an argument if we were in a debate and I had to take the other side. I'd say, well, Chris, that's true, but if you go back throughout American history, I mean, you could have said that the world was coming to or everything. You could have pointed out a lot of negative economic metrics back then as well. I remember listening to people in the 1970s talk about how the United States was, oh my gosh, we're $1 billion in debt now.
Yeah.
The world is coming, or whatever. I'm not saying that's what it was, but some very, very low number that would be around error today, and saying that the world was going to come to an end. And you got the Cuban Missile Crisis, you've got the Cold War. Look at what's happening with Russia. You could have pointed out a lot of negative things that were happening in the world and happening economically throughout the history of the United States, but we still managed to do well. So that's why I say that would be a valid argument if you completely ignore the economic cycles or the cycles of history that empires and civilizations go through. So if you were to say, point out a lot of problems in the 1950s as an example, right, but if you look at that through the lens of historic cycles, you would see that, okay, that's at the end of a world war. You're a decade later, and the probability of shit hitting the fan, so to speak, within a decade of a world war, probably pretty low, because you look at these, they're 80-year cycles if you want to look at the fourth turning. And if you look at the country like the United States, the probability that it's in stage 5 or stage 6 of this cycle that Dalio talks about. Stage 5 and 6 are the end stages. Right after you win a world war, you're not at that stage, right? So now it's different from the standpoint of, yes, there are a lot of economic problems. Yes, there are a lot of geopolitical problems and powder kegs, but there's also something that you have to layer on top of that, which is the fact that we're in the late stage cycle as a society, as a civilization in the United States. Now, I don't want people to take that as though within 5 years, the United States is going to look something like Mexico. or is going to look like Venezuela today. No, no, no. Listen, the Britain, as an example, they went through this exact same cycle, and they're not Venezuela. There are a lot of look at the European nations that have gone through this before, and they don't necessarily. It's just that they have this slow deterioration and decline, and they're not the world superpower they once were.
Right.
And standard of living kind of stagnates. So you could imagine a United States that what we have seen over the past, I would argue, 10 years since they really started doing QE, maybe a little before then, and what has accelerated quite dramatically over the last 2 years, you're just going to see more of that. And it's probably going to happen a lot faster. And this is the wealth gap, I would say civil, social unrest. You're just going to see a lot more of this. You're going to see the middle class being hollowed out. You're going to see a lot more homeless people, a lot more drug use.
Already happening. All this stuff's already happening. All you got to do is open your eyes to see this stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're just going to see a lot of deterioration. I mean, the whole state of California is probably going to look like Detroit. It's just, but there's going to be pockets that will do well, and there's going to be some people that will barely even notice. But as a society on net balance, the standard of living goes down significantly, but it doesn't happen overnight. It just happens very slowly. So from a standpoint of investment, or from a standpoint of entrepreneurship, something like that, you got to ask yourself, if you want as much tailwind at your back as possible, the United States probably isn't the best country in the world right now. That said, if you're someone who really values personal freedom and liberty, maybe it is. Because listen, if China's the dominant power in 10 or 15 years, and even the dominant economic power, that doesn't mean that they're the world leader in personal freedom and liberty.
Right. Very good. Very good point.
Yeah, I would argue that to the contrary. So, if you're someone that has those as priorities,
right?
Yeah, then the United States might be your best bet, even though the standard of living is going to decline, and we're going to go through some crisis situations, and you're going to see a lot of social unrest. I would argue that the place to be is probably a poor country where the government just doesn't have enough money to meddle with your day-to-day activities.
Right.
That's where I like to spend most of my time, in countries they're not third world. They're very nice. They're very pleasant. I spend a lot of time in Colombia, as you know, in Medellin, and the standard of living is very, very high. Cost of living extremely low, but the government really isn't big enough, or doesn't have enough money to really give you problems. Now, that could change, but that's why I think over the next 8 years, going into 2030, that if possible, people need to have as much personal flexibility as they can as to where they want to spend time. And because the world is just changing very, very quickly. So there is no perfect country where economically they're doing the right things, and they're also doing the right things from a standpoint of freedom and liberty. It's just, you've got to just assess the pros and cons, and then determine what your priorities are.
Yeah, very good points. Because a lot of times I spend time writing about how things are deteriorating here, but it is also worth noting that, just because a country like China may be advancing on the economic stage, or, there's tremendous sacrifice that comes with that, like you were saying earlier.
Yep.
I mean, they're preparing their people to be a nation of rugged individuals, right? Like we were 60, 70 years ago, in order to achieve this progress and to affect significant change. And so there's trade-offs that come with that as well. And I'm not by any means saying that, things are honky-dory there and things are happy and joyful all the time, or that it's, replete with liberty and freedom, because that's not the case. But it doesn't mean that there's not cause for concern on our end, and it also doesn't mean that the quality of life as we know it, as relative to what we've been used to here in the country, isn't gonna decline, right?
Yeah, it's another thing I tried to think through is an example of a country that has been in stage 5 or 6, as Dalio outlines in his book. Those are the last 2 stages, that has pulled themselves out of it. And I can't find an example of that.
Really?
I wish I could, because if you're an optimist, which I like to be to a certain degree, I like to be a realist first and foremost. But looking at the glass half full, you'd say, okay, well, let's not just wave the white flag here from an economic standpoint. What can we do in the United States to change things? And obviously there's things that we could do. Now, would you be able to pull them off? That's a different set of probabilities. And based on what history has shown us, the answer would be no. But I still think it's worth trying.
Yeah, and I think you make some very good points. I want to ask you a kind of simple question now, and just one more comment on that. You're talking about historical cycles. It's just one of those things where if you don't really get it, if you're not really seeing it the way that we're talking about it, or the way that I write about it, or the way that a guy like Andy Schectman talks about it, just zoom out. And I think that's something I've been saying for 10 years, 20 years about monetary policy. Zoom out. We shouldn't be thinking about a, 6-month plan or a 1-year plan. Certainly the Chinese aren't, right? They're thinking about the next 100 years, the next 10 generations, right?
Yep.
Zoom out.
That's right.
Look at what the country has become over the last 60, 70 years. The profound changes in productivity, the profound changes in monetary policy. Has that weakened the country, or has it made it better? And those are the kinds of very serious questions that, when you look at them over the span of decades instead of, quarters, or election cycles is another one that, people like to use. I think it just becomes a hell of a lot clearer. So, go ahead.
And that's one blind spot or Achilles heel that I think we have as a society, because our country is so young. I mean, in a country this young, 50 years is a big deal.
That's right.
In a country the age of China, 50 years is a blink of an eye. And so I think it's far easier for them to just have that long-term thinking ingrained in the psyche of the culture and the society at large.
Let's talk real quick about COVID, because last week I think President Biden said, all right, well, the pandemic is officially over. And, because that's how a pandemic ends. It's, an 80-year-old, an octogenarian.
By decree.
Stands at a podium and says, we've done everything we can do, and there's no need for alarm anymore. And
I think it's really obviously the timing here. This has nothing to do with midterms. Right. He just happened to make this announcement. Right.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, where you think the country is at in terms of I really think there was somewhat of an uprising that led elected officials to believe that the public isn't going to stand for lockdowns or bullshit anymore. I think they got the message. I really do. I predicted at the beginning of this year, I wrote an article that, 2022 would be the great COVID pivot. The mainstream media would be forced to pivot. Vaccine mandates for restaurants would go away. Just, capitalism and common sense would kind of drive that outcome. Where do you think we are as a country? And really, I guess globally too, in terms of COVID. Have you looked at this? I put something up the other day from Dr. Richard Ebright, and he was kind of laying out all the 2018 NIH grants and all the things that make it, in my opinion, very clear that COVID came out of a lab. I want to know if you looked at that at all and how that's kind of being a little bit more. It just certainly seems like natural immunity, George. A lot of these things that were conspiracy theories at the beginning, all of a sudden have once again are being gently kind of sprinkled into the public discourse in the ether and accepted. My guess is ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine will be the next things kind of accepted now that billions of dollars in vaccine sales have been made. Where do you think we are here, and how do you think this has ended over the last couple of months?
Yeah, what's interesting is I just saw an article in the Huffington Post saying, I don't know what the exact headline is, I don't recall, but it's something to the effect, here are the side effects that you need to be aware of with the new booster shots. Like, think about them coming out with that a year ago.
Right.
Or my point is, there's no way they would have come out and said anything other than safe, effective, safe, effective, safe, effective. And now all of a sudden you've got the Huffington Post coming out and saying, well, there are some side effects that the true scientists are finding that you need to be aware of,
right,
type thing. And you had a great article that I retweeted yesterday where you just basically highlighted 30 or 40 of these comments that have been made by the people in the mainstream, the authoritarians, the central planners, and the mainstream media that have been proven unequivocally false, or where they just completely contradicted themselves. And these are the people that are trying to censor the rest of us. They're the ones that are, standing up and shouting about the dangers of misinformation and disinformation.
Right.
And they're the ones who are spreading the most disinformation and misinformation themselves.
Right.
And it's ironic, but I guess, again, if you look at history, that's the way it usually works. Another book I was reading the other day, or listening to, they were talking about in the 1930s how, whether it was the left or the extreme left or the extreme right, from a standpoint of communist Russia or Nazi Germany, they both set up effectively what was kind of the Ministry of Truth. And it was a propaganda, and it was where they tried to control the societal narrative, and then they tried to really influence or control the media. And it's always for the same reason. It's always to prevent dissidents, or, the way they always set it up is people that are dangerous to democracy,
right,
or people who are dangerous to the objectives of the collective state that we all agree on. In this case, maybe the science or something like that. It's obvious that we're evolved to the point where we want to follow the science, right, Chris? And the science says blah, 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 blah. And therefore, anything that you say that is contrary to the science, it needs to be squashed and it needs to be censored. This is the argument that you've heard over and over and over and over again from totalitarian regimes. And it's the exact same argument you're getting today from the central planners, the mainstream media, and the authoritarians.
Right.
It's absolutely word for word verbatim. Why? Because it's worked. These people aren't stupid. They read some of the same history that you and I read. They look at what happened, but there's a different interpretation. See, they look at what happened in Nazi Germany and say, oh, wow, that worked well. That's a great idea. Let's go ahead and implement that. Where you and I look at it in absolute horror. Right?
Yeah, and it's always interesting, as it's unfolding, to hear guys like you, and you're way more preemptive than I am, and I will give you credit for that. You certainly were with Russia going into Ukraine. I think you had a clearer take on it than I did from the get-go. And with COVID, I bet at the very beginning I would have succumbed to the fear a little bit more than you would have, and I'll admit that. And you probably had the sharpest, clearest mind take on it. But it is very interesting at the beginning to look of these events and see people like you that say, oh, well, this is, there's a lot of fear being used here. And, fear helps get people to do what you want them to do, which, by the way, I totally agree with. And I said at some point, a month or two after the pandemic became a thing, but probably not as early as you did. But it's interesting looking at that then and then looking back at it now. And, when we were in the midst of the vaccination campaign, I was fucking proper weirded out because I was stoked on getting the vaccines out there. I thought it was going to take, 12 months, despite the fact that everybody said 18 months. I thought it was going to be a net positive at first. Of course, I didn't predict that they were going to be mandated, which I wouldn't have supported. And I didn't predict, I couldn't predict what I called a Soviet-style propaganda campaign to get vaccinated. And when it started happening, I was fucking freaked out about it. It was just like, it's like one of those.
It's so
it's
obvious,
like one of those,
too.
yeah, it is. And it's like one of those books you read, man. It's like, I remember this book I read in like high school called The Wave, about a group that starts in a high school and it becomes a cult and everybody starts walking around with the patches on their arms and and it just kind of spun out of control. And that's what I felt like. I felt like, holy shit, like, look at all these people just walking around. Like, everywhere I go, I would go for a run. There was this old billboard on a back road in New Jersey that I was running on regularly when all this shit went down. Like, way off the beaten path. It was like an access road that was closed, so the billboard got, like, no traffic. Even that billboard, somebody had pasted a fucking thing over it, New Jersey Department of Health. Get vaccinated so you can go back to your son's hockey game or something. And a picture of a grandmother, going to her son's hockey game. Like, let's get back to normal. Just get the shot and everything will go back to normal. And, of course, that was part and parcel with the other lies. Like, it'll stop COVID. Yep. You won't get the infection, all this other shit. And everybody got the shot, and what happened? We didn't go back to normal. They fucking tried to do the mask mandates again after the vaccinations, and everybody said, fuck that. We're not doing it. We're not fucking doing it.
Yeah, which is another positive for the United States long term. When you've got a society that's that willing to give the finger to the government once they get frustrated enough, that's the society where you want to be if you're someone that values that personal freedom and liberty. They most likely wouldn't have done that in China. And I remember end of 2020, I was right around Thanksgiving of 2021 when the Omicron variant came out, and I tweeted and I said, this could be the end of COVID. Everyone's getting freaked out about it. But I said this could be the end of it because it gives Biden a way out,
right? Where
he can say, okay, well, now this isn't as bad, therefore we can pull back all these policies that are wildly unpopular. Because remember, that's when they were, forcing the airlines to fire pilots, and
that was fucking
that didn't
crazy.
get the. Oh yeah,
that
and then remember the nurses and the frontline workers, they were firing them if they didn't get the shot, and they were wondering why, we have a lack of pilots and a lack of nurses.
And yeah, exactly. One headline would be the mandates, and the next one would be Biden administration is attempting to help stop the airline pilot shortage. It's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Par for the fucking course with government, but geez.
Yeah, but it just goes back to kind of having to scratch your head and wonder. At the time, what is their plan? What is the motive here? What's the objective? Because it really doesn't make sense. And if the objective is just to maybe strengthen the unity of your team, right, meaning the left and right, I think, quite frankly, that if the right would have taken the position that the COVID was bad and everything, and the left would take, we'd be in the completely opposite. I mean, there is no intellectual rigor here with the right and the left.
No,
it's just simply what team are you on,
right?
And based on what team you're on, that's what you believe, and that's why I think it's so important to be principled. You're talking before about kind of my response to when COVID first struck, March of 2020, April of 2020. And, looking back in retrospect, yeah, I fortunately made some good calls, but that was very difficult to do. Now you can look back and say, oh yeah, well, standing up against the lockdowns made a lot of sense, or the mask mandates, whatever. But back then, that was not an easy decision to make. Right. It was even for me. And there was times there that I thought I really had to say, you know what, my position on this could kill a lot of people, because there just wasn't enough information, right? And at the time, it makes sense. Masks looked like they're going to work to me. Why wouldn't they work? It just kind of intuitively made sense, because you're putting something over your face. Or lockdowns. I remember when Sweden first kind of bucked the trend there with the lockdowns, I was concerned. I remember thinking to myself, this might not end well in Sweden. And so, but I remember like it's yesterday, it was actually on your podcast. You asked me point blank what we should do. And it was a very difficult question to answer, because again, at the time, we just didn't have any information other than this was going to spread very, very quickly, because the R0 value was so high.
Right.
And it could impact hospital capacity. And this could be, we could talk about millions and millions of people dying here. And I said that I don't know how bad it's going to get. It's not the flu. It's going to be worse than that. But we have to let people make their own decisions. We have to, if people want to go outside, let them go outside. The government should give the people as much information as possible, but then you have to allow them to make their own decisions. If they want to get a vaccine, great. If they don't, fine. If you want to keep your business open, great. If you want to go outside and walk your dog and play on the beach, you go nuts. But here's the data. You're an adult. Now go ahead and make the best decision for yourself and your family. And people can say, oh, well, that's bad because of X, Y, and Z. Right. But you're dealing with a situation that's a cost-benefit analysis where there is no good solution. There's only a bunch of bad solutions or bad decisions, and you got to pick the least bad one.
And you walk through the city now, and you see how many businesses are still shuttered. All right, all you got to do is walk down a place like South Street in Philadelphia, and you can see the storefronts that have never reopened from COVID. And you look at the damage that was done by the lockdowns, combined with the negative consequences we're feeling now from papering over the economy by printing the money. And you just look back.
Yeah, that's the big thing there.
You just look back and say there had to be, even enduring the pain and just letting people do, like what you said, just letting people make their own decisions, we would have had a much better outcome. We'd be in a better place now. But again, as is usually the case with monetary policy, we don't want to take the medicine when it's time. We want to kick the can down the road. And so the consequences are worse so that we can feel a little bit better, at the time.
Yeah, what it boils down to is people don't like to make hard decisions.
Correct.
And so let's just say for a moment that and I don't believe this is true, because I think the lockdowns actually made it a lot worse from a health standpoint. But let's just say for a moment that if we would have locked down even harder or longer, right, that we would have saved another million people. But yet inflation, instead of being at 8.3% right now, would have got up to 20%, which is better.
Right.
Right. Is 20% inflation for 2 years worth a million people? I don't know, because and someone that didn't really have any economic understanding, they'd say, okay, well, of course, we're going to take the inflation. Well, not so fast. Because that 20% inflation for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, you're going to have a massive negative impact on a lot more than a million people.
Right.
And it might not lead to them dying, but you might have an additional million deaths, plus the destruction of purchasing power, therefore the lower standard of living, the anxiety, the drug use, the physical abuse, the physical assault, the crime that goes up, all of these things. How do you quantify that? And those are the tough decisions that societies and people don't like to make, because they like it to they want it to be a movie.
Right.
They want it to be like a Tom Cruise Mission Impossible movie, where there's a silver bullet
Right.
that we can use that will just give us everyone a happy ending. And what they don't understand is that's not the real world, especially when you're going through these late stage cycles. Is you've got a lot of, like I said, a lot of really bad options, and you've got to pick the least bad. But if we're not even willing to have the conversation, then there's no way we can make the right decision.
That's right.
And that goes back to this censorship that we were talking about. And excuse me. And look, this is the way out. If you want to know the way out, this is how we do it. Now, I think the probability of us moving this direction is quite low. But if we wanted to get serious, if I had to kind of draw out a game plan, it's where people on both sides start to have public debates. I think that, again, let's go back to COVID, right? If you could have had the top proponent of the vaccines or the vaccine mandates, and then you could have had like Brett Weinstein, and Joe Rogan would have hosted a debate between both of them. I think if you start doing that with these hot button issues, that's the way I think we progress as a society and get back to economic strength. And as far as inflation, monetary policy, fiscal policy, all of these things. And that's what they used to do in the 1970s. I watch YouTube videos of Milton Friedman debating all of these people. And it's very civil, very civil. And a lot of it was on public TV, on PBS and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so, but now it's the complete opposite, where if you're on one team, you don't even want to talk to the other team because they're not worth your time. And their ideas are, quote unquote, dangerous, right? That's not how you make good decisions when the only options you have moving forward are bad options. It's just taking the least bad, and where you have to do a constant cost benefit analysis of everything that's happening. Again, Russia's a great example of that. Look at the sanctions. You want to talk about not doing a cost benefit analysis. I mean, it's exactly like the lockdowns. They're just, let's just do knee-jerk reaction on what we think is going to be most politically expedient, what's going to buy us the most votes, and let's just virtue signal.
Right.
And the results be damned. And then when you look at the actual, I get this on Twitter all the time, and it never ceases to amaze me. Where even now you can look at the sanctions and say, well, they were the only people that they really impacted negatively were the Europeans and people. And sure, it's not like negative or Russia came out unscathed there, but the major people that it impacted were the average Joe and Jane in Europe. And then you look at this, the price cap, right? You want to talk about complete economic insanity. This is just complete virtue signal. Obviously, to anyone with half a brain, it doesn't affect Putin at all in the least. The only thing it's going to do is negatively impact the average Joe and Jane in Europe. And you hear these people on Twitter constantly say, well, we have to do something. That's always the pushback. Well, we have to do something. No, you don't. No, you don't. If doing something is going to make it worse, then don't do
anything.
that.
Right.
It's just the position that you're in. And it's just another great example of people not having the ability or the willingness to do a cost-benefit analysis. And it's something we just absolutely have to do, not just with an individual level, but with the politicians, with the central planners, all of them. That if we are to come out of this late-stage cycle and hit the reset button, not to use that word, but if we're able to start again at cycle one to where we're back on the economic upswing here, and we're going to remain a world economic superpower, then again, these are the things that we have to, just basic stuff, but it's just so hard for people to implement.
Yeah, well, I think it's your willingness to stand on your principles and react accordingly, even when it is uncomfortable, like you said earlier. That is what draws people to you, and I think it's what makes you a unique voice. And the only other person off the top of my head that I can think of that I know stands by their principles as steadfast as you do, probably Schiff does that, and Ron Paul comes to mind too. Was just unwavering in standing by his principles, and it showed up in his voting record too. That he would often he would often be the one vote against something that even people on the right side of the aisle would support, because it didn't stand by his constitutionalist principles. And so there's something to be said for that, and I think people need that, and I think people now are seeing the benefit of it more, and I think going forward they will. And so, look, I just before I let you go, I want to thank you again for continuing to support my show. I want to encourage my listeners to check you out over at Rebel Capitalist Pro. That link is in my podcast description, and if you want to just let people know what you have going on over there, now hopefully that you're on the men's, and then I'll let you go.
Yeah, it's a great investment resource, because you've got myself, Lynn Alden, Chris McIntosh. You've got their back end research, and then you've got live streams with other pros like Brent Johnson, Patrick Seresna, Jason Hartman, on a monthly basis that are exclusive for our members. So if you're trying to figure out what to do with your portfolio to really not just survive but thrive in this insane world, then I think you should check it out. I think it's well worth your time. One thing I want to leave your listeners with, though, as far as an idea, some food for thought that I think we should all be contemplating right now, is that we didn't touch on the global elite, and I think this is another power dynamic that needs to be addressed. We talked about the United States and China, but I think it is a little different than past history that Dalio talks about, because of this. The global elite are like a nation in and of themselves, as far as this thirst and lust for power to dominate the world, in my opinion. And their two main objectives, if you really get down to the nitty gritty of what they explicitly say, and it revolves around climate change. They want the rich countries to use a lot less energy, and they want the poor countries to reduce their population growth.
Right.
That's in their words. Now, you might say they want to reduce their population, period. And I think there might be an argument for that. But then look at, and I would encourage all of your listeners to look at the EU's response, or the kind of the central planners over there. Look at their response to Russia, and notice what it's doing. It's creating an environment where the rich countries are using a lot less energy, and the population growth in the poor countries, Africa, South America, is probably going to be reduced via food shortages and food crisis. So you're creating an energy crisis, reduces energy use in wealthy countries. You're creating a food crisis, which most likely reduces population in the poor countries. And you're doing it all in the name of sticking it to Putin. But I think it's interesting, and I would say suspicious, that all of these policies just so happen to get us closer to the global elite achieving their objectives. Just food for thought.
Sure. No, I think you're dead on, and I think climate change is going to be the vessel with which they, it's going to be the next little fear carrot hanging on a string, that if we don't do this, by the so-and-so point, we're all going to die, and, you're not a good person if you don't support it, and which is just ridiculous, because you can support common sense ways to deal with climate change, But again, I think it's a brilliant way to kind of force the hand of weak-minded individuals, and it would really be a great tool to kind of shoehorn their way into the agenda that they want going forward. Not the least of which includes, printing and spending trillions more money, reallocating trillions more in purchasing power to the resources that suit their needs, right?
Yeah, and it all goes through them first. Before we go here, one quick question I've got for you that I wanted to ask, because I've been trying to figure this out myself. Do you have any friends or know of any people that are still wearing a mask? And if so, not that, again, if that's your personal decision, go nuts. I have nothing, I don't want to disparage that.
Yeah.
But if so, have you asked them what their end game is? Because, and I've wondered that myself. When I see someone wearing a mask, I'm like, I wonder, have they thought about what their end game is? Because COVID isn't going away.
Right.
It's gonna be here. So have they actually thought about the fact that either you got to rip the Band-Aid off right now, or you've got to be okay with wearing a mask quite literally for the rest of your life.
Right.
And I don't know if they've had that internal dialogue. So I'm just very curious if you've had that conversation with someone.
Well, I'm not sure that they have. I have some relatives that are a little bit older that still wear masks, and I don't give them any shit for it. They can do whatever they want, and I'm fine with. I support that. I support their right to wear a mask if they want to.
So do I. I'm just curious what their rationale is.
Yeah, I think that from what I can recall, broaching the subject, I think I just got an answer like, we'll stop when we're comfortable. And I think that's going to be the case with a lot of people. And I think a lot of this is psychological. I think a lot of people have to come to terms with what has happened, what the outcome has been, what the, reality of the situation is. And that's not something, that's like somebody that has endured some mental trauma of sorts.
Yeah, it's like a PTSD type thing.
Yes, and it doesn't just go away. It needs to be processed. It's like something that you would go to a therapist for almost. It's something that needs to be processed. It doesn't just go away on its own. I don't think, not in any type of timely fashion.
Right.
And so, look, I see it every day here in the city. I see people walking around on a day-to-day basis, on the path on Kelly Drive, going out for their runs with masks on, walking through the city, in the open fresh air with their masks on. I don't know what it's going to take. And I just saw somebody this morning when I was running too. I was outside. I was at 38th and Market, just walking around with a mask on, young person. And, part of me wants to be a dick and be snarky about it, but it's their decision. And I think for a lot of people, they'll eventually come to it. It just takes a while, I think, for people to process everything that's gone on. And I don't think people, there's a lot of people out there that don't see the world like we do.
Yeah, I think that's what I was going to say.
In addition to that, I think there's a lot of people out there that see the world the total opposite way that we do. So when our biases are more prone to protecting ourselves, protecting our liberties, acting within reason, finding pragmatic solutions, and, just trying to be pragmatic in general. I think that there are a lot of people that are the total opposite. I think people probably in the middle have started to realize that, okay, maybe I don't need this mask anymore. But I think there's a lot of people all the way on the other side of the spectrum that will make mountains out of molehills, not because it's any fault of their own. It's a product of how they think, or it's a product of their upbringing, or whatever.
Well, I think it's a product of how they don't think, and I don't say that to make fun of them, because that's fine. Most people, I think, make decisions based on their emotions and how they feel. And I think you just hit the nail on the head. They're going to stop wearing a mask when they feel comfortable.
Right.
And where you and I would stop wearing a mask if we just look at a chart and say, oh, wait, these masks aren't working. Okay, I'm not going to use it. Regardless of how you feel,
right.
that chart's going to override what you're doing. And then for me, like I said, it's you got two options. You rip the Band-Aid off now, or you just tell yourself and be okay with the fact that you're going to wear a mask for the rest of your life.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but there is no way that George Gammon is going to wear a mask for the rest of his life. So
well,
yeah.
and I'd love to support you, but I just don't care enough to try to even, say, well, you got to do it now or you got to do it never. Just do whatever you want. I'm fine. Just don't fucking make me wear one.
No, I'm in the exact same boat. I'm always just fascinated about the psychology behind the decision-making process.
Of course, yeah, and I do think I think there's a deep psychological element to it. I went back and listened to Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Peter McCullough on Rogan, which I really thought marked the turning point, by the way, in terms of the mainstream narrative on things. Having the, it was those articles that prompted me to write my article at the beginning of this those interviews that prompted me to write an article at the beginning of this year saying, the mainstream media was losing the fight of its life against Joe Rogan, which I really thought was the case. And now we've seen, basically just a complete and total purge at CNN, which I think is kind of the result of what started at the beginning of this year. But I went back and listened to those things, and you hear him talk about, and Weinstein talked about this too back in the day, about, the psychosis that results from this. And it's very real. It's a very real state of collective psychosis that the world has been placed in to some degree. And so it's going to require more than just, Mayor Kenny saying it's okay to not wear a mask for some of these people. And that's fine. I wish them all the best in dealing with it. But, I got shit I have to do in the meantime. And so do you.
Yep.
All right, George, thanks so much for coming on, dude. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time, for taking an hour and a half for my rinky-dink little podcast when you are really crushing it with all your shit, man. I'm so happy to see you doing well, and I think my prediction holds true that either you or Colum's going to wind up on Rogan before the end of the year this year. So you got three months to make it happen, and I better get a goddamn shout-out. That's all I can say.
All right, Chris, thanks for having me on, buddy. It's
Talk to you soon, George. Thanks, buddy. That was the one, the only Mr. George Gammon of Rebel Capitalist Pro, one of my absolute favorites and just a wonderful person to talk to and an incredible resource. Thank you guys so much for listening. I will be back with a new podcast relatively soon, but for right now, I have shit to do, as I mentioned already. That doesn't involve you. Sorry, I'd like to boost your ego and tell you that I'm thinking about you all day, Mr. or Mrs. Listener. But the answer is, unfortunately, I am not. So I'm out of here. Fucking peace.